Welcome back, PetaPixel viewers. It is Chris Nichols here. Jordan and I are coming to you from the Sony launch event for the A9 III in beautiful New York City. Hey Jordan, have you figured out what you're going to get me for the holiday season?
What? Now I have to get you presents too?
Why wait, Jordan? You know I want used camera gear. I love it. So why not just go to kh.com? You can get up to 40% off pre-owned gear. I mean, it's like it's always on sale. And don't wait too long. Their inventory is always going through fast. So if I see something I like and I tell you, you need to buy it for me now. And Jordan, rest assured, KH has been in this business for 40 years, certifying and appraising pre-owned gear. So I know all the stuff you buy me is gonna work great. I even get a 180-day warranty on all those things that you are gonna buy me. So don't wait for all the holiday sales. Go to kh.com right now and buy me what I want. Now this is absolutely going to be a first impressions review, not a full review, because this is still a very early camera. It's not expected to come out until spring of next year, but we're going to talk about as much as we could talk about here. I mean, these cameras can't shoot RAW files, only JPEG, so keep that in mind, which means we can't get very far into the image quality on this camera. As well, we only have one camera to share between myself, Jordan Drake, and Jeremy Gray, one of the writers of PetaPixel. So we're all arguing and fighting and grabbing it out of each other's hands, and there's spitting and punching and hair pulling. It's rough. And because of that, Jordan can't shoot the video on the A9 III like we normally like to do, but don't worry, we're going to let him have the camera briefly to get some video samples for you guys as well.
Just brief, woo! Let's take this thing higher than you ever been. Stand tall like Everest, I mean higher. You ain't gotta settle in, go places they never been. We go higher, non-stop, take it to the top, even when the ball drops. My man, we go higher, it's time to go higher. Let's take this thing higher. Higher than you ever been, non-stop, stand tall like Everest. My man, we go, it's time to go.
Okay, so we've tried to find a fairly quiet part of the gym to talk here. I want to cover what's at the heart of the A9 III, and that is a brand new sensor. This is by far the most exciting part of this camera. We now have a global shutter 24 megapixel full frame sensor. So first off, this means we don't have a mechanical shutter at all, there's no need. But unlike a stacked sensor that reads out from top to bottom, this reads out the entire sensor in one go, and that has huge benefits and ramifications for what we can do with this camera and how we can shoot with it. So one of the big changes you'll find right off the bat is this camera can also shoot up to 120 frames per second, and that is with full autofocus, full 14-bit RAW capability, lossless compressed, uncompressed, doesn't matter. Now this global shutter does unlock a seriously fast shutter speed. So first off, we've got a maximum 80,000th of a second shutter speed. There is a caveat though. At the time of the release of this camera, there is a limitation. As long as you're shooting f1.8 or above, you can get that 80,000th of a second shutter speed. Otherwise, you're gonna get 16,000th of a second as a maximum shutter speed. That's still very quick. I should also point out that 16,000th of a second is your maximum shutter speed where you still get continuous autofocus. If you go above that, it is gonna lock it. But again, we're talking a very fast shutter speed, and down the road, that capability may change. We may unlock faster shutter speeds in the future. Okay, now this is a first impressions video. We got a lot to cover, but I do want to talk about some handling differences. But before I do, make note we've got flashes firing in the background. Jordan's shooting me right now on a Panasonic G9 II. It's a fast reading sensor, but you're still going to get banding from the flash. We'll address that in just a bit. So the main changes that I notice here, so first off, the grip is a different look to it. It's a little bit more comfortable, a little bit more molded. As well, the whole body design is different. They've now done this actually quite sexy beveling around the body, rounded corners. We're kind of getting away from that classic boxy shape that we often see with Sony bodies. We do have some other interesting changes. These top custom buttons are more raised, easy to press. We've got now a locking dial here and a switch for all of our autofocusing modes right underneath our drive dial. That also has a push-in toggle button. One thing that I wish that was changed, on the back we still have this kind of annoying toggle lock for this back command dial. I can turn it on or off to lock it, but the mode dial is still a press in and twist. And again, I just find when you're quickly shooting, it's weird to have your brain have to adjust between two different kinds of toggling switches. Now, because this is a camera that's aimed at sports photographers and photojournalists, we actually have some really nice ports here. Full HDMI port, PC sync if you want to go old school with your flash sync. We do also have an Ethernet connection here. A lot of sports photographers and journalists will love that. Classic USB-C as well as a micro USB for data, and our headphone and our microphone jacks as well. So first, an example of something I can't do, because I am clearly not a professional boxer, but this is what I can do. I can tell you that the battery arrangement and the media card arrangement is very similar to what we've seen in cameras like the Sony a7R5. Sony Z-type batteries, which we love, they last a long time. We still don't have exact CEPA ratings yet for this camera, however. And then the media is going to be a twin SD card / CFexpress Type A arrangement like we've seen before in a lot of their other cameras. And it doesn't end there, because when it comes to the EVF, we have another improvement here. This has a 9.44 million dot EVF. We've seen that on the Sony A1, but on the A1, it would often drop resolution, especially when you went to a higher refresh rate. On the A9 III, we're not seeing any drop in resolution up to 120 hertz. If you go up to 240, you will get a drop, but honestly, I don't find many situations where 120 hertz isn't adequate. So what we've talked about before on cameras that don't have mechanical shutters, like the Nikon Z8, for example, or the Z9, is that they've got fast sensors that read out quickly enough that rolling shutters shouldn't be an issue. And rolling shutters, where if something's moving through the frame, you're going to get diagonals that form because it scans the top at a different time than when it scans the bottom. With a global shutter, that completely goes away. There's no rolling shutter issues whatsoever, regardless of how fast your subject's moving or what shutter speed you happen to use. Now, you still can get banding under artificial lighting. I mean, artificial lighting is still going to cycle at different exposures, and your camera can pick that up. But what the Sony a9 III does have is a feature that can look for that flicker and then only trigger the exposures at the brightest point, and that way you don't get that variance in exposure. Okay, so while the Northrop's photobomb are shot here, let's talk about a very... Yeah, I know. Let's talk about an interesting feature here. So the a9 III now adds a custom 5 button. It's actually in the front near the lens mount. And one interesting thing that they demoed is their speed boost mode. And we're not going to call it speed boost, that's too simple. We're going to call it like ultra nitrous explosion technology. Anyways, of course you can customize this button to do anything, but this speed boost function is quite useful. Let's say you want to shoot 120 frames per second, but not all the time. I mean, you're going to fill up your buffer really quick, you're going to fill up your card really quick. It's rare that we need to shoot that fast. You can have the camera set to a much slower shutter speed, 8 frames per second, 20 frames per second, whatever you feel is more appropriate. And then when you need that 120 frame per second burst, simply hold down the button, it engages the speed boost, even if you're already shooting with the shutter held, and it will automatically engage a faster speed. This could be really great in a sports and action situation where the moment of action is coming up and you really want to make sure you capture it. So indoor gymnasium full of fit dudes playing beach volleyball with professional inflatable softbox lighting. In Canada, almost unheard of, but here completely normal. Every block has one. Anyways, there is now a pre-capture mode on the Sony a9 III. Of course, we've seen this in other companies' cameras. This is now a first for Sony, but it's a welcome thing. So this pre-capture mode works a lot like we've seen before. Basically, when you touch the shutter, the camera's buffering and then will record a certain amount of frames before you touch the shutter. This is really helpful when you're trying to get that decisive moment. Maybe your timing's not perfect. So on this camera, you can choose up to a second of pre-capture before you touch the shutter, and this is what it'll do. Let's say I'm shooting at 120 frames per second, the fastest rate. Well, I will get that second before, and then whatever's left on the buffer will fill after I've pressed the shutter button as well. So I can choose before or after the moment that I really like. Okay, but let's say you don't need 120 frames per second for pre-capture. So you can then shoot at slower frame rates, 30, 60, whatever you want. You're still gonna only get up to 1 second before you've pressed the shutter, but then you can continue to hold down the shutter after that and keep shooting until the buffer fills. And basically whatever frame rate you have will dictate how sooner or later that buffer fills. All right, so we have a nice setup here. We got people kickboxing, we got flashes going on, pro photo strobes, and this really does showcase one of the strengths of a global shutter. So just to give you context, I'm shooting the a9 III here. I'm at f2.8, ISO 400. I'm shooting at thousandth of a second, okay? Way beyond what a traditional mechanical shutter or electronic shutter will give you. And we can go way higher than that. We can fire strobes up to, 16,000th, 80,000th of a second, no problem. So the real advantage here is that we don't get any sort of banding, and you're probably seeing that in the background on the footage that Jordan's shooting right now. And there's some real benefits here. I mean, first off, I don't have to use high-speed sync like I would normally have to use on a traditional TTL flash system where I lose tons of power output. Also, it means that if I go outside and I want to outcompete the lighting that's there, being able to go up to incredibly fast shutter speeds without any sort of sync issues means that I could turn day into night in the background and just have really well-lit subjects. I mean, these are very interesting strengths that we don't normally get on a mirrorless camera like this. So shooting here at Chelsea Pierce Fitness Center, we've had lots of opportunities to shoot lots of different sports. You know, what we can see from the autofocus is it's reliable, the hit rate's excellent. We're getting 759 autofocusing points, which is very similar to the Sony A1, for example, but we're getting 95.6% coverage across the sensor. This has basically the same autofocus algorithms that we've seen on the Sony A7R5. So, although we don't have the opportunity to test like animals and planes and trains and automobiles as much, I'm still gonna say that I'm pretty sure the autofocus hit rate is gonna be excellent. From what I've seen so far on the camera, it's doing a great job. So we had a very hectic day as usual at Chelsea Talks there, and then we did the usual press trip thing where we race back to the hotel, download all our photos, have a look, and then make some assessments. And so this is what we could talk about now that it's nighttime. So as I mentioned earlier, we weren't able to shoot RAW files on the camera as far as evaluating image quality, but we were able to put it into RAW mode and then do some buffer tests. And we talked earlier about the pre-capture mode, but we also wanted to see how many shots we could get before the card fills and then how fast it would clear those cards. So, first thing we found, with lossless compressed, we were getting about 127 shots roughly before the buffer filled. So at 120 frames per second, you're looking at just over a second of record time. If we went down to something like lossy compressed, well then what we were getting is more like 200 to 240 shots around there before the buffer filled. So that's where you're looking more at getting extra shots if you need them. Now we also want to do a bit of an informal test just to see, once we've filled the buffer, how long will it take to clear on different cards. So first off, using the supplied Sony Tough CFexpress Type A cards, we could clear that buffer in just over 11 seconds, which is pretty impressive, absolutely. Using a Delkin Black V90 SD card, it wasn't bad, about 23 seconds to clear the buffer. That's still absolutely usable. But then I used a slower Sony card. It was about 300 megs per second, and that took about a minute to clear. So basically, the long story short, if you are gonna shoot this camera for sports and action and you wanna push to 120 frames per second or 60 frames per second, it's absolutely gonna pay to have faster cards in this camera. There is still the limitation here on the A9 III. If you're using third-party lenses, you'll be capped at 15 frames per second maximum. Obviously, on a camera like this with a global shutter and the ability to shoot up to 120 frames per second with autofocus in RAW, that's a big limitation. I realize a lot of people buying a camera like this won't be looking at third-party glass, but if that does apply to you, it is a big hit. So of course, image quality is something we would love to test on this camera, but it's just not ready yet, right? We can't process any RAW files. This is not a production camera, so we really are going to be waiting until we have a fully reviewable copy to really take a deep dive in this. But there are still some interesting things that we want to talk about. So first off, base ISO is 250, and in S-Log3, native ISO is 2000. Now what this implies as far as stills image quality goes, we might be taking a hit when it comes to dynamic range at lower ISOs. Sony is saying that if there are any compromises, they're minor. Of course, it's not something they're going to really give us a lot of information on, but we're definitely going to be looking for that. But it's also possible that higher ISO performance is going to be very good. Now, we're not looking at RAW files, but we thought, why not do a little bit of a test just to kind of wet your whistle and get the speculation going. So we shot the A7R5 versus the A9 III JPEG at 2000 ISO and at 20,000 ISO. So looking here at ISO 2000, looking here at ISO 20,000, although the A7R5 still has a distinct advantage in overall detail with its 16 megapixel sensor, and we still can't test DR properly, when we look at high ISO performance, it's pretty comparable. It's a lot better than I thought. Anyways, you guys be the judge off these images, but I'm eager to see what happens when we actually get a production camera. So the original Sony A9 and the A9 II were not exactly amazing video cameras, but that has changed now that we have the A9 III. So let's go to Jordan and find out more about video.
Hey, it's your old buddy Jordan to talk about the video capabilities on the Sony A9 III. And as soon as I got this in my hand, I thought right back to when the A7R5 came out. It brought a whole bunch of really useful video features to the Sony bodies, but with a sensor that didn't really make a lot of sense for video. But now we're seeing all of that stuff in the A9 III with a sensor that is basically perfect for video. So we've got the autofocus that utilizes their AI processor that can track even the most incredibly fast-moving subjects. But unlike the A9 series before it, we've got picture profiles, so we can shoot S-Log3 with a base ISO of 2000, like you can see right here. We've got the S-Cinetone, which is great if you don't want to grade the footage. But let's get over to the most important thing, which is the lack of rolling shutter on this camera. I mean, I was just so excited shooting athletes with absolutely no rolling shutter in the image. I'm just so used to seeing it. Then suddenly when I've got someone spinning a staff around, like you can see right here, it almost looks like a special effect. And I can see this camera being so hugely popular for filmmakers, documentary crews, if you're out shooting fast action or you've got strobes firing off in your footage. People are going to grab this camera just to have access to the look of the global shutter. And yes, we've seen global shutter cinema cameras before, but nothing that's this compact with great autofocus and stabilization that makes this extremely powerful for just capturing action on the go. Now, what does that global shutter mean in terms of slow motion capabilities? Well, we can shoot 4K up to 60p, and that's oversampled, where we're getting the full 24 megapixels of information. And for the first time in a Sony Alpha body, we have 4K 120 full width. Now, that is subsampled, so there should be a bit of an image quality penalty compared to 4K 60. I'm going to test that extensively, as well as the dynamic range and low light performance once we get a production camera. But for now, let's throw it back to Chris to wrap things up.
So Sony shows once again that they're innovators in the industry. We now have a global shutter in a full frame mirrorless camera. And it's exciting because Jordan and I have been wondering for years, when are we going to see this technology come to the full frame market? There's a lot of advantages, there's a lot of interesting benefits, which you've hopefully gotten across in this first impressions video. But of course there's a lot of questions as well. I mean, what kind of challenges is this chip going to represent? What kind of compromises have taken place? And we're going to look into all that when we do finally have a full product to review. But it absolutely puts the other manufacturers on notice now to see if they can keep up. And absolutely there's some skepticism out there and a lot of questions, and I know that you guys have those too. Especially what's the dynamic range going to be like? I mean, we rate dynamic range very highly when it comes to image quality, high ISO performance. It looks good so far from the files that we've seen, but we really need to test that further. And at the same time though, I'm not so concerned about that. I think global shutters make a lot of sense because let's remember that the A9 III is a specialized tool. I mean, this is firmly aimed at sports photographers and journalists, and the strengths of the global shutter really play to that arena of photography. You know, it's great that we're not going to have rolling shutter issues on this camera, and it's clearly pushing the industry more and more towards this electronic shutter only kind of world, which I think is a great way to go. But it's also exciting how this is going to change flash photography. I mean, people are going to be able to do things with flash that they've never been able to do before. And that's a good thing because I feel like in the industry, flash has been getting less and less use by a lot of photographers as cameras have gotten just better and better in low light situations. Being able to outcompete the sun with incredibly fast shutter speeds, not have to worry about banding issues. I mean, this is a big change. Regardless, we're looking forward to being able to play with a full production A9 III and be able to evaluate raw files. That's going to be great. So definitely click the notification bell, subscribe to the channel, make sure you don't miss that when we bring out our final review on the Sony A9 III. And absolutely leave questions below, leave comments below. Let us know what you think about this brand new innovative camera. On the podcast, we're going to be talking about everything that we've seen here in New York City. So definitely go check out the podcast. It's on the same channel where you can find it on all your favorite podcasting apps. But otherwise, it's time to leave the far more photogenic but quite noisy New York City and head back to Calgary where it's quiet but cold. Thanks for joining us. We'll see you guys soon with another episode of PetaPixel.